What is sleep?
Sleep is probably the single most effective thing you can do to reset your brain and body health. So that's a functional answer in terms of, what is sleep in terms of its benefits. Sleep as a process, though, is an incredibly complex physiological ballet. And if you were to recognize or see what happens to your brain and your body at night during sleep, you would be blown away. And the paradox is that most of us, and I would think this too, if I wasn't a sleep scientist, we go to bed, we lose consciousness for 7 to 9 hours, and then we sort of wake up in the morning and we generally feel better. And in some ways, that denies the physiological and biological beauty of sleep. So upstairs in your brain, when you're going through these different stages of sleep, the changes in brainwave activity are far more dramatic than those that we see when we're awake. And we can speak about deep sleep and what happens there. REM sleep is a fascinating time, which is another stage of sleep, often called dream sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. That stage of sleep, some parts of your brain are up to 30% more active than when you're awake. So again, it's kind of violating this idea that our mind is dormant and our body is just simply quiescent and resting. So I would happy to just sort of double click on either one of those and also what changes in the body as well. But it is an intense evolutionary adaptive benefit and system. That said, though, I would almost push back against an evolved system when we think about the question of sleep and what sleep is. Our assumption has always been that we evolved to sleep. And I've actually questioned that, and I have no way to get in a time capsule and go back and prove this, but what if we started off sleeping and it was from sleep that wakefulness emerged? Why do we assume that it's the other way around? And I think there's probably some really good evidence that sleep may have been the proto-state, that it was the basic, fundamental living state. And when we became awake, as it were, we always had to return to sleep. In some ways, at that point, sleep was the price that we paid for wakefulness. And that's another way of describing what sleep is. But again, I think it sort of denies the active state of sleep. It's not a passive state of sleep either. And then finally, you can say what is sleep across different species. And in us, human beings, and in all mammalian species and avian species as well, sleep is broadly separated into these two main types. And we've got non-rapid eye movement sleep on the one hand, and then we've got rapid eye movement sleep on the other. And we can speak about how they unfold across a night and their architecture, because it's not just intellectually interesting from the perspective of what sleep is, it's also practically impactful for our daily lives. And I'd love to sort of go down that route.
You mentioned how active the brain is during certain phases of sleep. When I was coming up in science, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, was referred to as paradoxical sleep.
Yeah.
Is that still a good way to think about it? Paradoxical because the brain is so active and yet we are essentially paralyzed, correct?
Yeah, it really is a paradox. And where that came from was simply the brainwave recordings. That if all I'm measuring about you is your brainwave activity, it's very difficult for me sitting outside of the sleep laboratory room to figure out, are you awake or are you in REM sleep? Because those two patterns of brain activity are so close to one another, you can't discriminate between them. Yet the paradox is that when you are awake, I go in there and you're sort of sitting up, you're clearly conscious and awake. But yet when you go into REM sleep, you are completely paralyzed. And brain activity is dramatically more similar than different. And the way I can figure out which of the two you are in is by measuring two other signals: the activity from your eyes and the activity from your muscles. So when we're awake, we will occasionally have these blinks and we'll have sort of saccades. But during REM sleep, you have these really bizarre horizontal shuttling eye movements that occur. And that's where the name comes from, rapid eye movements.
Are they always horizontal?
Mostly they are horizontal.
That's interesting.
And that's one of the ways that we can differentiate them from other waking eye movement activity, because it's not always, it can be sometimes horizontal, but can also have diagonal and also vertical in that plane. But then the muscle activity is the real dead giveaway. Just before you enter REM sleep, your brainstem, which is where the dynamics of non-REM and REM are essentially played out and then expressed upstairs in the cortex and downstairs in the body. When we go into REM sleep, and just a few seconds before that happens, the brainstem sends a signal all the way down the spinal cord, and it communicates with what are called the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, which control the voluntary skeletal muscles. And it's a signal of paralysis. And when you go into dream sleep, you are locked into a physical incarceration of your own body. Why would Mother Nature do such a thing? And it's in some ways very simple. The brain paralyzes the body so that the mind can dream safely. Because think about how quickly we would have all been popped out of the gene pool. You know, if I think I'm, one of the best skydivers who can just simply fly, and I've had sometimes those dreams too, and I get up on my apartment window and I leap out.
You're done.
You're done,
Yep.
So that's one of the that's part of the paradox of REM sleep, both its brain activity similarity, despite the behavioral state being so different, and this bizarre lockdown of the sort of brain of the body itself. Now, of course, the involuntary muscles, thankfully, aren't paralyzed. So you keep breathing, your heart keeps beating.
Is this why men have erections during REM sleep and women have vaginal lubrication during sleep?
That's one of the reasons. Part of the other reason, though, there is because of the autonomic activity. So there is a part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, and it controls many of the automatic behaviors. And some of those are aspects of our reproductive facilities. During REM sleep, what we later discovered is that you go through these bizarre, what we call autonomic storms, which sounds dramatic, but it actually is when you measure them. That you'll go through periods where your heart rate decelerates and drops, and your blood pressure goes down, and then utterly randomly, your heart rate accelerates dramatically, and what we call the fight or flight branch of the autonomic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, badly named because it's anything but sympathetic, it's very aggravating, that all of a sudden fires up, and then it shuts down again. And it's not in any regular way. And it's when you get those autonomic storms, you get very activated from a physiological perspective, that you can have these erections and you have vaginal discharge, etc.
But you're totally paralyzed.
But you are still paralyzed. There are only two voluntary muscle groups that are spurred from the paralysis. Bizarre. One, your extraocular muscles, because if they were paralyzed, you wouldn't be able to have rapid eye movements. And the other that we later discovered was the inner ear muscle. And we've got no good understanding as to why those two muscle groups are spurred from the paralysis. It may have something to do with cranial nerve, but I don't think it's that. I think it's perhaps something more sensory related. Some people have argued that the reason the eyeballs are spurred from the paralysis is because if your eyeballs are left for long periods of time inactive, you may get things such as oxygen sort of issues in the aqueous or vitreous humor.
I would imagine that there are states in waking that also resemble slow wave sleep, or rather that there are states that slow wave sleep also resembles waking states. You beautifully illustrated how REM sleep can mimic some of the more active brain states that we achieve in waking. What sort of waking state that I might have experienced or experience on a daily basis might look similar to slow wave sleep, non-REM sleep, if any?
It's a genius way of thinking about it, turns the tables, I love it. We almost never see anything like the true ultra slow waves of deep non-REM sleep. So we spoke about these two stages, non-REM and REM. Non-REM is further subdivided into 4 separate stages, stages 1 through 4, increasing in their depth of sleep. So stages 3 and 4, that's what we typically call deep non-REM sleep. Stages 1 and 2, light
So maybe
non-REM.
take me through the arc of a night, just so that.
Yeah.
So I put my head down. Well, for you, what time do you normally go to sleep?
So I'm usually sort of around about a 10:30 6:30 p.m. guy, and usually I'll naturally wake up sort of a little bit before 7, sometimes before 6:45 or 7. I have an alarm set for 7:04 a.m. I am so human, and I've had my sleep issues, and I'd love to speak about that too. But it's only just in the event that because I like to keep regularity too. You've got to keep those two things in balance. And 7:04, just because why not be idiosyncratic? I don't know why we always set things on these hard numbers. So. Yep. So when
you go to sleep around 10:30. So using you as an example, because I imagine a number of people go to sleep at different times, but 10:30 is about when I go to sleep. 11 is for me. But so you go to sleep at 10:30. So for that first, let's say 3 hours of sleep, what does the architecture of that sleep look like as compared to the last 3 hours of your sleep before morning?
Yeah. So I should note that sort of 10:30 to 7, that's just based on my chronotype and my preferential. It's different for different people. I'm not suggesting that that's the perfect sweet spot for humanity's sleep. It's just my
But I imagine most people probably go to sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight. And
somewhere
most probably
between like
wake
9
up
and
between
midnight.
5 a.m. and 7 a.m. or 5:30 and 7:30.
Yeah. At least if you look at sort of first world nations, that's a typical sleep profile. So when I first fall asleep, I'll go into the light stages of non-REM sleep, stages 1 and 2 of non-REM. And then I'll start to descend down into the deeper stages of non-REM sleep. So after about maybe 20 minutes, I'm starting to head down into stage 3 non-REM and then into stage 4 non-REM sleep. And as I'm starting to fall asleep, as I've cast off from the, usually with me, murky waters of wakefulness, and I'm in the shallows of sleep, stages 1 and 2, my heart rate starts to drop a little bit. And then my brainwave pattern activity starts to slow down. Normally, when I'm awake, it's going up and down maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 times a second. As I'm going into light non-REM sleep, it will slow down to maybe 15, 20, and then really starts to slow down to about sort of 10 or 8 cycles per second, 8 cycle waves per second. Then, as I'm starting to move into stages 3 and 4 non-REM sleep, several remarkable things happen. All of a sudden, my heart rate really does start to drop. Oh, and I'll come back to temperature. I'm going to write temperature down because I always forget these things. Now I'm sadly in the foothills of middle age. So as I'm starting to go into those deeper stages of non-REM sleep, all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of cells in my cortex all decide to fire together, and then they all go silent together. And it's this remarkable physiological coordination of the likes that we just don't see during any other brain state.
It's really interesting. Having recorded from the brains of animals and a little bit from humans, I don't think I've ever seen the entire cortex or even entire regions of cortex light up like that.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's almost like this beautiful sort of mantra chant. Or this sort of, it's a slow inhale and then a meditative exhale. Inhale, exhale. And these waves are just enormous in their size.
And the body is capable of movement at this time. There is no paralysis.
There is no paralysis, but for the most part, muscle tone has also dropped significantly at that point. And then I will then stay there for about another 20 or 30 minutes. So now I'm maybe 60 or 70 minutes into my first sleep cycle. And then I'll start to rise back up into stage 2 non-REM sleep. And then after about 80 or so minutes, I'll pop up and I'll have a short REM sleep period. And then back down I go again, down into non-REM, up into REM. And you do that reliably, repeatedly, and I will be doing that, and I do that every 90 minutes. At least that's the average for most adults. It's different in different species. What changes, to your question, is the ratio of non-REM to REM within that 90-minute cycle as you move across the night. And what I mean by this is, in the first half of the night, the majority of those 90-minute cycles are comprised of lots of deep non-REM sleep. That's when I get my stage 3 and 4 of deep non-REM sleep. Once I push through to the second half of the night, now that seesaw balance changes, and instead the majority of those 90-minute cycles are comprised either of this lighter form of non-REM sleep, stage 2 non-REM sleep, and much more and increasingly more rapid eye movement sleep. And the implication that I was sort of speaking about pragmatically is, let's say that I have to, and I usually never do early morning flights or red eyes, just because I'm a mess if that happens. I'm not suggesting that other people shouldn't.
I'm suggesting people not do that. Every time I've taken a red eye or I've done that, 2 or 3 days later, I get some sort of general feeling of malaise. My brain doesn't work as well. I think red eyes should be abolished. For the pilots too, I mean, and for
and we can speak about those.
And for the emergency room, I mean, long shifts have been shown to lead to physician-induced errors that lead to a lot of fatalities. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why staying up too long or being up at the wrong times, if you're not adapted to, it, is just terrible.
The data in all of those cases, and particularly physicians too. There was some recent data looking at suicidality, and the rates of suicide in training physicians are, far, far above the norm. And I don't suspect that, their schedules are helping them. I suspect that sleep is a missing part of that explanatory equation. But
I teach medical students, and they're phenomenal, but they're under extremely challenged conditions. It's
we shouldn't put them under those
it's not.
conditions.
It's not optimizing performance. I have one.
But sorry, I was sorry.
No. This is important. It's an important digression. I have one question, which is, you're saying that as across the night, a greater percentage of these 90-minute cycles are going to be occupied by REM sleep as you progress through the night. I'm aware that based on work that you've done and from your public education efforts and others, that we have so-called circadian forces, and we have other forces that are driving when we sleep and when we want to sleep, et cetera. Without going into the details of those, I have a simple question. The experiment is the following. Let's say, God forbid, you are prevented from going to sleep at your normal time, and you stay up for the 4 hours or 5 hours that normally you would be in predominantly slow wave sleep. If, let's say, you finally get to lie down at 3 a.m., a time when normally your sleep would be occupied mostly by rapid eye movement sleep, will you experience a greater percentage of rapid eye movement sleep because of these so-called circadian forces, meaning that's what's appropriate for that time? Or will your system need to start at the beginning of the race that as I'm referring to it, that we're calling sleep? If that's not clear to anybody, basically what I'm asking is, if you are forced to skip the slow wave sleep part of the night, will your system leap into rapid eye movement sleep, or does it have to start at the beginning and get slow wave sleep first? In other words, does one sleep state drive the entry to the next sleep state?
Great question. So there is some degree of reciprocity between the sleep states. I should note that when we drive one of those up, we often, but not always, see a change in the other. There are some pharmacologies that have shown an independence to that. And we've also played around with things like temperature, and sometimes you can, nudge one and not seem to upset or perturb the other. But to your, I think, lovely point, the answer is it's a mix, but it's mostly the latter, meaning you will mostly go into your REM sleep phases and be significantly deficient in your deep sleep. So just because I start my sleep cycle at 3 a.m. rather than at 10:30 p.m., it doesn't mean that my brain just says, well, I've got a program and I'm just going to run the program. And the way the program runs is that we always start with the first couple of hours of deep sleep. So we're just going to begin act number 1, scene 1. It doesn't do that. Now, I will get some deep sleep to begin with. And part of that is just because of how sleep works based on how long I've been awake. Longer I'm awake, there's a significantly greater pressure for deep sleep. But we actually use exactly what you just described as an experimental technique to selectively deprive people of one of those stages of sleep or the other. So we will do first half of the night deprivation and then let you sleep the second half. So that means that you will be mostly deep sleep deprived and you will still get mostly all of your REM sleep. And then we switch it So you only get your first 4 hours, which means you will mostly get deep non-REM sleep, but you will get almost no REM sleep. So in both of those groups, they've both had 4 hours of sleep. So the difference between them in terms of an experimental outcome is not the sleep time, because they've both slept for the same amount. It's the contribution of those different stages. Now we actually have more elegant methods for sort of selectively going in there and scooping out different stages of sleep. But that's the way we used to do it old school, was just using this timing difference.
And who suffers more, those that lack the early phase or those that lack the later phase of the night sleep? In other words, if I have to sleep only 4 hours for whatever reason, am I better off getting the early part of the night sleep or the second half of the night sleep?
Depends on what the outcome measure is.
So that gets right to the differences between slow wave sleep and REM.
Right.
I was probably misinformed, but my understanding, a very crude understanding, I should say before.
I very much doubt it. Au contraire with someone like you.
Which is that very nice of you. But the first part of the night, the slow wave sleep, is restorative to the musculature, to motor learning, and that the dream content tends to be less emotional. The second half of the night being more emotional dreams and sort of the unpairing of the emotional load of our previous day and other experiences. So in other words, if I were to deprive myself, of REM, I would be hyper emotional, maybe not as settled with the kind of experiences of my life. Whereas if I deprive myself of slow wave sleep, I would feel a more physical malaise. Is that correct, or is that far too simple? And if it is too simple, please tell me where I'm wrong.
No, I think much of that is correct, and it's sort of that plus. Mm-hmm. So, for example, during deep non-REM sleep, that's where we get this, it's almost a form of natural blood pressure medication. And so when I take that away from you, the next day, we're usually going to see autonomic dysfunction. We're usually going to see abnormalities in heart rate, blood pressure. We also know that during deep non-REM sleep that there is a certain control of specific hormones. For example, we know that the insulin regulation of sort of metabolism, meaning how will you look from a regulated blood sugar perspective versus dysregulated pre-diabetic look of profile. That's where deep sleep seems to matter. If we selectively deprive you of that, we
growth
can see
hormone.
Growth hormone is different, actually. So that's a beautiful demonstration where growth hormone seems to be more REM sleep dependent. And that's why we can come on to the effects of alcohol. And there's some really impressive, frightening data on alcohol and its disruption of sleep. But then we also know testosterone. Peak levels of testosterone happen during REM sleep.
It's the second half of the night.
Which is the second half of the night. So it really just means that your profile of mental and physical dysfunction will be different under both of those conditions. Which one would you prefer? I would prefer neither of them, and it really depends on what you're trying to optimize for. So it's just so complex. Sleep is just so pluripotent. It's so physiologically systemic that it's almost impossible not to undergo one of those two things, just deep sleep deprivation or just REM sleep deprivation, and not show a profile that you would really prefer to avoid. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason, from an evolutionary standpoint, that we have preserved those stages of sleep. I mean, sleep is just so idiotic, from an evolutionary perspective.
Or maybe waking is idiotic.
Or waking is, I think
based on your previous idea.
Who have you been talking to? I think that comment is very specific to me. I am normally always an idiot when waking. But I think this idea that sleep, is so profoundly detrimental to us if you were to take it at face value. You're not finding a mate, you're not reproducing, you're not foraging for food, you're not caring for your young, and worst of all, you're vulnerable to predation. On any one of those grounds, sleep probably should have been selected against. But it wasn't. Sleep has fought its way through heroically, every step along the evolutionary path. And therefore, every sleep stage has also survived as best we can tell. What that means is that those are non-negotiable. If Mother Nature had found a way to even just sort of, thin slice some of that sleep from us, there would have been vast, I'm sure, evolutionary benefits. But it looks as though she hasn't. And I'm usually in favor of her wisdom after 3.6 million years. So
yeah, it's incredible. I want to introduce another Gedanken experiment, another thought experiment. So in this arc of the night, slow wave sleep predominates early in the night and then REM sleep. There's a scenario that many people, including myself, experience on a regular basis, which is they go to sleep, sleeping just fine, 3-4 hours into it, they wake up.
yeah.
They wake up for whatever reason. Maybe there was a noise, maybe the temperature isn't right. We will certainly talk about sleep hygiene, etc. They get up, they go to the restroom. They might flip on the lights, they might not. They'll get back in bed. Hopefully they're not picking up their phone and starting to browse and wake up the brain through various mechanisms, light and cognitive stimulation, etc. They go back to sleep. Let's say after about 10, 15 minutes, they're able to fall back asleep, and then they sleep till their more typical wake time.
Yeah.
How detrimental is that wake-up episode or event in terms of longevity, learning, etc.? I would love to sleep the entire night through every night, but most nights I don't, and yet I feel pretty good throughout the day. Some days better than others.
Yeah.
So if you were to kind of evaluate that waking episode and compare it to sleeping the whole night through, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think if you're waking up sort of frequently as you're describing, I would probably get your estate in order, because my guess is within the next year you're going to be done for. No, I'm kidding you. Absolutely kidding you. It is perfectly natural and normal, particularly as we progress with age. You know, children tend to have typically more continuous sleep. Now, it's not that they aren't waking up for brief periods of time. They are, and in fact, we all do. When we come out the other end of our sleep cycle, at the end of our REM sleep period of the 90-minute cycle, almost everybody wakes up and we make a postural movement. We turn over because we've been paralyzed for so long, and the body will also like to shift.
Do we ever look around? Do we ever open our eyes and look around?
Sometimes people will open their eyes, but usually it's only for a brief period of time, and they usually never commit those awakenings to memory.
Right.
Your situation, and it's my situation as well. I usually now at this stage of life, I don't sleep through the night. I'll usually have a bathroom break, and then I'll come back. That's perfectly normal. We tend to forget that in sleep science, we think of sleep efficiency. So of the total amount of time that you're in bed, how much of that percent time is spent asleep? And we usually look to numbers that are above 85% or more as a healthy sleep efficiency. So if you were to think about me going to bed and I spend, let's say 8.25 hours of time in bed with a normal healthy sleep efficiency, I still may be only sleeping a total of 7.5 hours or 7.75 hours, meaning that I'm going to be awake in total, not in one long bout, but I'm going to be awake for upwards of 30 minutes net some time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that can be after a 10-minute, dalliance after having gone to the bathroom, and I'm just gradually drifting back off again. Other times it will just be for a couple of minutes, and most of those you don't commit. So I think we need to stop. We don't need to get too worried about periods of time awake just because we're not sleeping throughout the night. I would love to do that too, and I remember when that used to happen, and it still happens occasionally.
It feels great when it does happen.
It's a lovely thing,
but it's a surprise, right?
It is not now a surprise.
Through the whole night.
Yeah, it is a surprise. Yeah. But for the most part, I think we can be more relaxed about that. Where we have to be a bit more attentive, though, is if you are spending long periods of time not being able to get back to sleep. And usually we define that by saying, if it's been 20, 25 minutes, normally that's a time when we would really say, okay, let's explore this. What's going on? Let's see what's happening. The other thing is if it's happening very frequently. So even if you're not awake for 25-minute stretches, but you're finding yourself waking up and being consciously aware that you've woken up for maybe 6, 7, or 8 times throughout the night, and your sleep is very what we call fragmented. the great science of sleep in the past 5 or 10 years has been, yes, quantity is important, but quality is just as important. And you can't have one without the other in terms of a good, beneficial next day outcome. You can't just get 4 hours of sleep, but brilliant quality of sleep and be unimpaired. Right. Nor can you get 8 hours of sleep, but have very poor quality of sleep and be unimpaired the next day. So that's why I just sort of want to asterisk this idea of let's not get too worried about waking up and having some time awake. That's perfectly normal and natural. But if it's happening very frequently throughout the night, or those periods of time, or long stretches of time, upwards of 25 minutes, then let's look into it.